Welcome back to part 2 of the Minimal Pokémon Challenge. In case you missed it, in the first part we took care of the first 3 generations, so check it out if you haven't yet. But just in case, I'll do a quick recap. We're trying to figure out the smallest team of Pokémon that can beat one game from each generation. We've gone through 4 games across the Game Boy, Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance, and our count currently sits at 8 Pokémon, including starters, mandatory gift Pokémon, and the occasional necessary HM helper. This time, we'll go through the 2 generations that span the Nintendo DS and figure out just how small the games allow our teams to be. And so, I ask once again, how many Pokémon do you need to beat the Pokémon franchise? Before we get started with the video, I'd like to go through some things you guys brought up in the comments of the first part of this challenge. First, some of you are keen on having a separate list of Pokémon for glitchless runs. Personally, I think glitches make these runs more interesting and dynamic, as they provide ways to go around otherwise impassable walls with less Pokémon than the game would allow you to, all while only using tools the game itself gives you. As I'm looking for the minimum number of Pokémon needed, it will be inaccurate for me to ignore any major ways to reduce that number, so I'll still be using glitches wherever it's applicable. However, I will still show what glitchless runs look like, as I did in the first part with my first Pokémon Red run, and I'll keep additional Pokémon needed for glitchless runs on the list with a different color. For our list as it currently stands, the only difference is a single Pokémon needed for the first generation games as an HM slave. Secondly, I'd like to bring some clarification to the rules as I stated in the last video. There were a couple of comments confused on why I, for example, picked Charizard for Pokémon Red and then clicked Blastoise for Leaf Green, whereas if I picked Charizard for both, I'd only have used one Pokémon total. The rules as I meant for them to be would still qualify this as 2 separate Charizard, not as one entry. I'm trying to find out the lowest number of Pokémon needed, not the lowest overall number of species, so I've been trying to pick different Pokémon where possible, just to have a more varied list at the end. However, I have to agree that I'm very interested in a challenge in which you try to get the least possible Pokédex completion across all games, minimizing the number of species you can collect while still beating them. So I'd like to explore this at some point. I won't be covering it just yet though. I feel like this kind of challenge is better saved for when I have knowledge of the minimal amount of Pokémon needed across all of the games, so as to properly plan a route from start to finish. So I'll save this for the last part of the challenge, or even make an extra part just covering this. Then, there were some questions about trading. Some of you pointed out that had I transferred Pokémon from previous games over to later ones, I could potentially skip catching some extra HM users, and complete games with smaller overall teams. As nice as this sounds, it is not that simple. It's true that nowadays you can just transfer Pokémon freely between games, and even to older ones, but in earlier generations you are locked into 2 ways. Transferring a Pokémon from a previous generation, or trading within generations. For the first case in pretty much every game, bringing over Pokémon from older games only gets unlocked after you beat the game, and in some cases you even have to complete the Pokédex. As for trading, the important part is the term. To trade, by definition, you need to provide the Pokémon on each side, and you can't trade your only Pokémon if you only have one. So if I, for example, wanted to trade my Swampert over to my Leaf Green game, to maybe save catching a second Pokémon, even if we disregard the fact that you actually need to beat Leaf Green to be able to trade with Emerald, you'd still need to catch a Pokémon to trade with anyway, so we wouldn't be saving any Pokémon in the end. Finally, some people were as unsatisfied as I was with the amount of Pokémon we needed to beat Pokémon Silver. The Gen 2 games aren't nearly as buggy as Gen 1, but there are still plenty of warping tricks, not to mention arbitrary code execution, or ACE as it's commonly known, so there's no way we can't skip 1 or 2 of them, right? At the very least, on a glitchless run we have Kingler on our red cartridge that we can trade over for Togepi, which would save us catching Gyarados. Well, let's take the trading argument first. You can only trade with Generation 1 if you have a Generation 1 Pokémon on your Generation 2 game, and in our case we would have both a starter, all of which are 2nd generation Pokémon, and Togepi, who also is. So sadly that is a dead end. So that leaves us with the glitches that I didn't fully explore last video. I did some research into them at the time, of course, and the conclusion that I got was that for this particular case, we'd need no less than 3 Pokémon to use Ace, with our third being a Quagsire, so no Pokémon could be saved that way. Still, after reading some of the comments, I decided to dig a bit deeper. So I reached out to some of the pro glitch hunters in the Glitch City Research Institute Discord, and I was apparently mistaken in a couple of assumptions. Turns out that yes, it did used to be the case that you needed 3 Pokémon on your party to execute Ace, but apparently nowadays that is no longer true. So what does this mean for our Pokémon Silver run? Well, first we picked Totodile as a starter. I still can't skip the Togepi though. I think it is theoretically possible to do it, if you use a glitch used in an any % speedrun involving the Mystery Egg to warp directly to Goldenrod City, though it takes a great amount of skill and patience to plan out and execute. You not only need to hit an extreme amount of frame-perfect windows, but also to know how to actually write code in the game to be able to do the actual warping. I gave it a couple of tries myself, but I'm nowhere near skilled enough to both figure out the correct box names and to execute it. So for now let's just declare the Togepi as unskippable and continue on. Once we make it to Goldenrod, we go to the Pokémon Center and interact with something we haven't yet had to touch and probably never will again, the PC. We rename box 1 as this bunch of gibberish, then we do a couple of random but necessary steps. Get a coin case and a flower mail, make sure we have 100 coins in there, write another bunch of gibberish in the flower mail and give it to one of our Pokémon. And then it's time for the magic trick. We go to the radio tower, save and reset, move in a specific way, listen to a Bellsprout cry, read the gibberish mail, and then we use the coin case. Nothing happened. Well, to be clear, it looks like nothing happened, and to be fair, nothing has happened yet. The repercussion of what we just did will only be felt later, much later in the playthrough. I'd say around here. You are looking at the only required uses of Waterfall in Pokémon Silver, the whole reason why we needed an extra Pokémon. Right after this is Victory Road, so we're completely blocked from beating the game right at the last second. So what now? Well, it's simple. It's time for Togetic to shine. The Ace code we triggered earlier had one specific effect, and that was to set the Indigo Plateau as previously visited, which means that we can fly to it. So we can skip the required use of Waterfall and move on to the Elite Four and the Champion without the extra Pokémon we caught along the way, and reduce the required Pokémon to beat Pokémon Silver by 1. As I mentioned, I believe it's definitely possible to skip the Togepi as well, but the earlier method of Ace, using the Mystery Egg, and teleporting in general, are exponentially more complex than what we just did, so since I can't confirm it's possible, we'll leave Pokémon Silver with 2 Pokémon for now, but I will continue looking into this between videos. So, with all that out of the way, let's get straight back into it, with Generation 4. Sinnoh offers us 3 games to choose from, Diamond, Pearl and Platinum. As with the generations that came before it, the 2 games that released first are functionally identical as far as this challenge is concerned, so the real choice is between these 2 and Platinum. If you thought about picking Pokémon Platinum, you just fell into a gigantic trap, as it's home to one of the greatest betrayals in the Pokémon franchise. So, Pearl it is. And Sinnoh shows no signs of relenting as we move on to the required gems. Marking a new record, a whopping 6 of them are required to reach a champion. We have some previous staples like Cut, Rock Smash, Strength, Surf and Waterfall, as well as the newcomer Rock Climb. With this amount of required 8 gems, there is no way that any of the starters can actually learn all of them. I'm honestly just as shocked as you are. Empoleon can learn each and every required 8 gem, and even default for good measure. For the second generation in a row, the future looks bright for this challenge. A one Pokemon run isn't absolutely guaranteed at this point, but it sure is a nice start. The run through Sinnoh happens much like the first time we had full 8 gem coverage in our starter back in Hoenn. We beat every trainer with our starter and teach the 8 gems as they become necessary for progression. The challenge is slightly harder this time, however.
The first rival fight happens much later,
though luckily starter doesn't have access to a stab move yet. And the second gym leader Gardenia has a type advantage before we had the time to get too many levels past what the games expect us to have. Nothing that some healing items can solve though. And this is where the main villain of this run appears. Champion Cynthia has gotten the reputation of being one of the most ruthless champions in the franchise, posing as a great challenge even in the generation after this one. But despite that, nothing could prepare you for the absolutely despicable move she pulls in Pokémon Platinum.
Just after you beat Saturn and move towards the bike shop,
she stops you in your tracks and forces you to take a Togepi egg. Not any egg, a Togepi egg, the exact egg that the worst NPC in Pokemon history forced us to take back in Gen 2. This was the reason I went with Pearl. In this game, she gives you nothing and just lets you move on with your life. But we now know what she's capable of. Truly, she's the strongest champion. We have to teach Rock Smash fairly soon in our run to get past Ravaged Path, and we need Cut to access Team Galactic's building, though that's the only required Cut use, so we can remove it after we get to Canalave, which we have to learn Surf for. After that, Strength is required to let us into Route 216, and Rock Climb allows us to access the furthest reaches of Mount Coronet while pursuing Team Galactic. The 4th generation actually turned out to be the easiest one so far. I had my doubts before starting the run, but we're almost at the 8th gym, and we have no major blockers. We haven't even had to do any double battle so far, as the trainers simply refuse to fight you unless you have 2 Pokemon. So Empoleon has been able to clean house even when restricted to 4 8-gem moves, as its only means of attacking. Doesn't hurt that between fighting, water and normal type moves, it has neutral coverage against basically every Pokemon. Honestly, I don't think anything can stop it. You've got to be kidding me. Our free ride through Sinnoh ends here. To gain access to the fights with the Galactic admins, Icirrus and Palkia, we need to beat these 2 grunts in a double battle, which, as I mentioned, is impossible with only 1 Pokemon. They don't even give you the chance of taking them on one at a time. You simply get sent back to get another Pokemon. We don't have any space to work with here, and we can't even talk to them individually. This is it for our solo challenge in Pokemon Pearl. I catch a Bronzor in the area just before this, use it in the double battle, and basically go through what little's left in the game, including the final gym fight and the entire Pokemon League. And after beating Cynthia, we reach the end of Pokemon Pearl with 2 more Pokemon. Sadly, because of the one single required double battle in this game, this is as low as it will go.
Or is it?
Yes, it is true that we can't fight these true grunts, which in turn doesn't allow us to conclude the Team Galactic arc. And why do we need to do this? Because the way to Route 222 is currently blocked by this guy, and he won't move an inch before we conclude matters in Spear Pillar. And we already know that to be impossible, but that doesn't mean that accessing Route 222 is impossible too. If there was a way to skip this guy, then we'd be able to continue our adventure and completely skip the events at Spear Pillar, and consequently, the need for a second Pokemon. And while doing that might seem just as impossible, as it turns out, it is anything but. Let me introduce you to Tweaking, also known as Hole Punching, as an homage to the person that discovered this trick. I won't go too into it here, But essentially, you use your bike in specific ways to move too fast for the game to load the world around you correctly, allowing for all kinds of wacky effects to take place. In this case, by moving in a precise way on the grass patch on top of the block path, we can confuse the game, which allows us to go through the stairs and walk underground. Because the spot that the guy is standing on isn't checked as you pass, since why would it, there's a guy in the way, you can get past him and into Route 222 without fighting Palkia and retain our one Pokemon run. And yes, we left Team Galactic to potentially destroy the world, but that's a small price to pay to continue our one Pokemon dream. After gaining access to the rest of the game, we can beat Volkner and get the A-Gem for Waterfall, which we teach to Empoleon after forgetting Strength. After that, we use Surf to get through Route 223, Waterfall to gain access to Victory Road, Rock Climb to traverse the cliffs inside it, Rock Smash to clear the rocks in our way, and...
God damn it.
Having to use a full moveset's worth of A-Gems to get to this spot, Empoleon simply doesn't have space for Strength to progress through Victory Road, and the space here is too tight for us to employ the tweaking glitch we used before. It doesn't get simpler than that, we cannot get through Victory Road with only one Pokemon. So is that it? After all that, is a one Pokemon run impossible? All that effort, all that research thrown away just like that? And most importantly, would I really have drawn this out if the answer wasn't no? Welcome to the Distortion world. Wait, no, sorry, this is a different place. This is known as the Void. It is accessed through an extension of the tweaking glitch we talked about earlier, specifically by using it to enter the Poketch Company's headquarters from the wrong side, placing us in the black space outside the building. We then follow very strict movements to traverse this void, and after looking at our party to refresh the graphics, lo and behold, against all odds, we have skipped the entirety of Victory Road in one go and landed right in front of the door to the Pokemon League. After that, beating Barry, the Elite Four, and the champion is simply a matter of time. After everything that happened, we managed to beat a Generation 4 game with a single Pokemon. Now that's a pretty satisfying result. But we aren't done with Generation 4 yet. After all, we still have the remakes to explore. And with our first travels through Johto being the ones where we use the most Pokemon, maybe our high spirits will be short-lived.
Once again, no difference between the games, so I went with Art Gold.
Game Freak took the chance to revamp Johto a bit in this generation, but not much has changed in terms of required gems. So does that mean we are doomed with using 3 Pokemon this time too? Actually no. Like we talked about in the previous video, Feraligatr has gained access to Waterfall ever since Generation 3, so he now has access to every required gem. Unfortunately, Togepi is just as useless as before. It can now learn Rock Smash, but that gem isn't required on this generation, so it remains as a fly slave. That doesn't end up mattering though, if we consider that we need a single use of Cut in the whole game to get past Ilex Forest. That means that even though Feraligatr will end up with a moveset full of gems, we can get through the game without having to catch an extra gem slave, and go all the way to Lance and into the Hall of Fame with only 2 Pokemon, 1 less than before. Crazy how the more stable game gets beaten with as many Pokemon as its original counterpart. And like last time, I went ahead to check if we could beat Red without adding any more Pokemon too. However, this is not as straightforward as the last time we did it. This time there's an extra gem that is needed to actually climb Mount Silver, and that is the one that got introduced this gen, Rock Climb. Feraligatr could learn all the required gems so far, but there's no way a crocodile can climb sheer cliffs, right? Well, someone in the Pokemon Company clearly doesn't think so, because Feraligatr also got access to Rock Climb. so by slotting it into its moveset, we can go through all of Kanto and Mount Silver and beat Red with even less Pokemon than before. We even got to evolve our Togetic, so we don't have another duplicate on our list, which is nice. And that's it for Generation 4. Next up, we have the 5th generation, with the 2 pairs of Black and White, and Black 2 and White 2. We'll take this a bit differently than the ones I've done so far and jump straight to the gameplay before going too much into it. I picked Pokemon Black. To be honest, the only reason I did so was so I could have a darker background for this section for Dark Mode users. Our starter this time, surprisingly, is not the Water type. I picked Snivy as, believe it or not, he can learn every single required A-Gem for this game. That is in no small part due to the fact that there's a single required A-Gem use in the entire game, right here, in the Dreamyard, to take down this tree, preventing us from going further in. That's it. No Surf, no Strength, and certainly no Waterfall. Thanks to this, since Snivy can learn Cut, we can break our streak of water starters for the first time since Owen, though we could have still picked Oshawott, since it also learns Cut. Tepig, in the other hand, does not, so we couldn't have picked it. Picking Snivy as a starter might not have been the wisest decision though, just considering the gym leaders, half of them specialize in grass-type weaknesses, so it will be a bumpy road. The early game is actually both the hardest so far and the most straightforward. The early difficulty comes from battles against the first gym leader Chili and the rival Silent, both of which have some very powerful early fire-type Pokemon. Snivy, however, has early access to the setup move Growth, which carried me through not only this batch of tough battles, but for the rest of the game. 3 or 4 Growths at the start of every battle, and it was as good as one. And, since we have very little in terms of required A-Gems, we have room in our moveset for actually good moves, so our progress through the game is actually very smooth. But of course, as you've learned to expect, when everything starts seeming too good to be true, it doesn't take long for a bombshell to drop. And Unova didn't wait too long to dropkick our one Pokemon hopes to oblivion. These twins really wanna have a double battle, and they will block you from moving on until you have 2 Pokemon to fight them with. It is as straightforward as roadblocks get, much like the situation we faced back in Spear Pillar, except we're on Gen 5 now, which is much less glitchy, so we can't sneak past them the same way. Whether we want it or not, we're forced to catch a second Pokemon if we want to move on. We don't have a lot of choice this early in the game, so I went and grabbed the gift Pampur from the Dreamyard, and with it, we are able to fight the twins and move on with our playthrough. And move on we did, past all the gyms, all the trainers, slowly backtracking by foot whenever we had to because we don't have access to fly, and with relative ease we made it to the door of the Champions League with only 2 Pokemon in tow. Defeating the Elite Four is more or less trivial with access to a setup move, and after Team Plasmid Invasion, we make it through the castle towards the final face-off with N. And I imagine that this is the required catch that most of you that are familiar with this game knew was coming. As a part of the story, for the climatic fight against N, the game forces you to catch Reshiram. Even if you knock it out, it remains in your way until you catch it, so we are forced to let it join the team right at the last second. Because beating N here actually counts as having your Pokemon join the Hall of Fame, we don't need to beat the league again, and we can add the 3 Pokemon we acquired during our adventure to our list. And, in the spirit of trying to educate the super powerful trainers of the world about the wonders of small teams, we went and taught Cynthia a lesson she won't soon forget with our 3 Pokemon team. And that concludes Gen 5. What do you mean the sequels? The sequels are pretty different in their own right, sure, but I'd have to be pretty crazy to take the time and effort to research and go through a whole another Pokemon game, spending several extra hours for what would amount to little more than 3 more minutes of video, right? Why do I feel like there's a smash cut coming?
Pokemon Black 2 and White 2 actually differ from the original games in terms of required A-Gems.
The single cut use from them is gone, replaced instead with required uses of Strength and Surf. And while Oshawott cannot learn Strength, it luckily gains the ability to once it reaches its final evolution, which seems to theoretically hint at the one Pokemon run, though as we know, Pokemon games know how to dash our hopes in increasingly brutal ways. So how did this game do it? Well, directly after having to beat the hardest gym in Unova for a water type, we get our hearts broken. In the most literal way possible. Charles the Heartbreaker is making trouble, and to stop him and proceed through the game, we need to beat him in a rotation battle. A type of battle that specifically needs 3 Pokemon from each side. Yes, you heard me right. In Pokemon Black, the twins force us to catch 1 Pokemon, and in this one, Charles forces us to catch 2. It's not the only required rotation or triple battle in the game, so it's not a localized problem, but it is the earliest possible required one. With no other choice on our side, we catch 2 random Pokemon, taking the chance to nab a fly user for convenience later on. With them, we are easily able to dispatch Charles and move on with our lives. And surprisingly, we don't run into any more blockers for the rest of the game. No one forces me to take any more Pokemon, and catching a legendary is not mandatory, so our path to the Hall of Fame is, although hard, still inevitable, and soon we've entered 3 new Pokemon into the history of the Pokemon League. So in the end, both the original games and their sequels require the exact same quantities of Pokemon. I think this will come as a surprise to a lot of you. A lot of guesses I saw in the comments on the first part didn't know of these forced double on-rotation battles.
And now we can finally close the chapter on the 5th generation as well as on the Nintendo DS.
Having gone through 4 more games, we have added 9 Pokemon to our list, which makes our total now 16. If we disregard glitches, we are instead adding 10 Pokemon, and our list becomes 19 long. The Gen 5 games are now the ones that take the most Pokemon to beat with 3, but once again I think the next series of games might make a good case of dethroning them. So meet me back here next time, when we move to the Nintendo 3DS and to Pokemon's leap to 3D, and see how much longer the list is going to grow.
Hey, welcome to the end of the video. First thing, I want to give a huge shout out to the Glitch City Research Institute Discord, as well as the users Retire, TimoVM, Casual Pokeplayer, and Autistic Plush. They gave a huge help in figuring out all the glitches that I needed to bring up my count of Pokemon to as low as it got during this video. So a huge thanks to all of them. Secondly, thank you for making the last video such a huge hit. I never even dreamed that it will get as much attention as it did get. I read all of your comments, and please, if you find anything that I could have done better, or any Pokemon that I could have saved, please let me know and I'll look into it. The next videos will be about the 3DS, so all the 3DS games. They are pretty big games and each game gets bigger every generation, so it will take a while, but I will get to them. But in the meanwhile, I thought I'd share with you some good YouTube channels that I really like, so I could tide you over until the next video. First, I want to give a shout out to Scott's Thoughts. He does a lot of videos about Pokemon, specifically trying to beat Pokemon games as fast as possible with a single Pokemon. And he's even building a tier list with all of the Pokemon that he runs with and trying to figure out which ones are the best for beating the games. And it's really interesting, and I recommend you check it out. If you don't want content specifically about Pokemon and want just general video game content, then I can recommend you Sample. He has a lot of cool video game challenges just like this one. He did a video about beating Kirby without jumping, he did one about beating Shovel Knight without collecting money. They are all very interesting and very well edited, so they get a definite recommend from me. And if you just want to hear some good tunes, then I recommend Noteblock. He has a lot of very good video game remixes. I guarantee he has a remix of your favorite video game. He has a bunch of them, and they're all boppers, so do check it out as well. Hopefully you haven't heard of at least one of these, and they'll be able to tide you over till the next video. Until then, stay safe.